The rescue. The deep silence of space was broken by the soft hum of a small spaceship. Ethan Carter, a human pilot and explorer, sat in the cockpit, watching the endless darkness around him. His ship, the Horizon, was on an automatic course, scanning the nearby planets for signs of life. It was supposed to be a simple mission. Check, scan, report, return home. But fate had other plans for him. A sudden alarm beeped on his dashboard. An unknown signal. Ethan frowned and leaned forward. His screen showed a faint distress beacon coming from a small rocky planet nearby. His heart pounded. A ship in trouble. Out here. This sector was empty, far from any known space routes. "Computer, scan the area," he commanded. A moment later, the AI voice responded. One crashed vessel detected. No known identification. Ethan made a quick decision. If someone was alive down there, they needed help. The crash site. Ethan guided the Horizon through the planet's thick orange clouds. The atmosphere was rough, shaking his ship as he descended. When he finally broke through, he saw the ground. A desert of dark red sand, with jagged rocks spread across the horizon. Then he saw it. A wrecked alien ship, half buried in the sand. Smoke rose from the broken hull, and blue sparks crackled from damaged panels. Ethan quickly landed his ship a few meters away and grabbed his emergency kit. He activated his suit's oxygen supply, opened the hatch, and stepped out into the hot, dry air. The ship was silent. No movement. No sound. Was it already too late? Ethan climbed through a broken section of the hull and entered the dark interior. The smell of burned metal filled his nose. Sparks flickered from broken wires, and shattered glass crunched beneath his boots. Then he heard it. A weak breath. Ethan turned sharply. In the dim light, he saw a figure lying against the wall. A girl. Not human. The mysterious alien girl. She had smooth blue skin, glowing silver eyes, and strange markings running down her arms. Her black hair was messy, and her breathing was shallow. Blood, dark purple, leaked from a wound on her shoulder. Ethan rushed to her side. "Hey, can you hear me?" Her eyes fluttered open, unfocused and weak. She tried to move away, but she was too weak. Her lips trembled as she whispered, "Stay away. Human." Ethan ignored her protest. He wasn't about to let someone die, no matter where they were from. "I'm here to help," he said firmly. He pulled a small healing injector from his kit and pressed it against her arm. The device hissed as it delivered a dose of advanced medicine into her system. The alien girl gasped. Her body shivered for a moment, then she went still. Her breathing became steadier, but she was still too weak to move. Ethan lifted her carefully. She was surprisingly light. As soon as he touched her, a strange warmth spread through his hands, almost like static electricity. Then something happened. A shockwave of energy shot through his body, making him stumble backward. His vision blurred for a moment, and his heartbeat pounded like a drum. His hands tingled, and for a brief second, he felt like something was flowing into him. Something powerful, something alien. The girl's body glowed faintly for a second, then the light faded. Ethan shook his head, trying to clear his mind. What the hell was that? The girl's breathing was stable now, but her expression had changed. She was staring at him, not with fear, but with shock. "Human," she whispered again, her voice softer this time. "What did you do to me?" Ethan had no answer. The danger approaches. He carried the girl back to his ship, moving as fast as he could. The sun was starting to set, and the planet's temperature was dropping rapidly. As he reached the horizon, his ship's warning system beeped. "Incoming 38 DETs," he TE'd. Ethan froze. He turned and looked at the sky. Above the wreckage, a black shadow moved through the clouds, a massive alien warship descending fast. He didn't know who they were, but one thing was clear: they were looking for her. And if they found them, Ethan knew they were both dead. Cliffhanger. The escape. With his heart pounding, Ethan rushed into the ship and sealed the hatch. He placed the alien girl on the medical bed, then jumped into the pilot's seat. Come on, he muttered, his fingers flying across the controls. The ship's engines roared to life just as the alien warship fired a warning shot, shaking the ground nearby. The alien girl struggled to sit up, her silver eyes filled with fear. You have to run. Now. Ethan didn't need to be told twice. He gripped the controls and pulled the ship into the sky, just as the enemy warship locked onto them. The awakening. Ethan Carter's fingers gripped the controls of the horizon, his small spaceship trembling under the pressure of a sudden high-speed escape. His mind raced as he pushed the engines to their limit. Behind him, a massive alien warship descended toward the planet, its sleek black hull cutting through the sky like a predator locking onto its prey. They were coming for her. The alien girl, Lyra, was barely conscious on the medical bed behind him, her breathing ragged but steady. Who was she? Why were they after her? He didn't have time to think. The warning sirens in his cockpit blared. TAR GT lock-it. Missile incoming. Damn it. Ethan cursed. He yanked the controls, sending the ship into a hard left turn. The missile streaked past them, missing by only a few feet. His hands were slick with sweat as he forced the ship into a sharp dive, skimming just above the planet's rocky surface. The warship behind them fired again, this time a plasma beam. A blinding blue light filled the sky as the energy shot barely missed the horizon's right wing. The heat from the blast melted part of the hull, and alarms screamed in protest. Ethan had only one chance. Computer, prepare emergency warp, he shouted. Warning. Core power unstable. Jump drive at 40% capacity. He cursed under his breath. Not enough power for a long-distance jump. If he jumped now, they could end up anywhere in deep space, stranded, or worse, inside a star. But staying here meant certain death. Another missile launched from the warship. This time, Ethan knew he wouldn't be able to dodge it. Then, suddenly, a hand grabbed his wrist. Ethan turned sharply. Lyra had somehow managed to pull herself up from the bed. Her silver eyes were glowing, her face pale but filled with a strange energy. Let me, she whispered. What? You can barely move, Ethan shouted, trying to focus on flying. But Lyra's fingers tightened around his arm, and suddenly, a shockwave of energy surged through him. It was the same as before, the strange warmth, the tingling sensation. But this time, it was stronger. He gasped as his vision blurred. The ship's controls lit up on their own, as if responding to something. Something inside him. The missile was only seconds away. Then, everything exploded into light. The impossible escape. Ethan's ship vanished in a sudden burst of white-blue energy, disappearing into the vastness of space. For a moment, everything was silent. Then, Ethan woke up, gasping for air. His head pounded, his body burned like fire, and his vision was flickering in and out of focus. He felt like he had been ripped apart and put back together in an instant. The ship's lights flickered weakly. The engines were silent. Everything was still. They had escaped. But where were they? His fingers fumbled over the control panel. The navigation system was offline. The star charts were blank. The ship's power core was drained, barely keeping the life support online. He tried to move, but his body felt different. Stronger, lighter, as if something had changed inside him. A weak voice broke the silence. You saved me. Ethan turned his head. Lyra was still lying on the medical bed, her body glowing faintly. She looked exhausted, her face pale, but her silver eyes were locked onto him. No, Ethan said, his voice hoarse. You saved me. He stared at her, mind racing. What had just happened? The ship had jumped to light speed without using the warp drive. That wasn't possible. And yet, here they were. Lyra didn't answer. She simply closed her eyes, breathing deeply. Ethan could tell she was barely holding on to consciousness. Then something terrifying happened. As he looked at her, he noticed her skin was changing. The smooth blue tone of her arms was fading, turning lighter, closer to a human color. The strange markings on her skin were disappearing, like ink dissolving in water. Ethan felt his chest tighten. "What is happening to you?" Lyra's eyes fluttered open again, and for the first time, she looked afraid. The truth revealed. Hours passed. The ship drifted in deep space, silent and broken. Ethan finally got the emergency power running. The horizon wouldn't move anytime soon, but at least they could breathe. Lyra was awake now, sitting up with difficulty. Her face was full of emotions: fear, confusion, disbelief. Ethan sat across from her, arms crossed. "All right," he said. "Start talking." She hesitated. Then, finally, she spoke. "I am Zarelian, a warrior of the Zarelian Empire," she said. "Or, I was." Ethan narrowed his eyes. "Was?" She swallowed hard. "I was captured by my own people. They were experimenting on me." Ethan's stomach tightened. Experimenting. On their own kind. They were trying to create a weapon, a being that could harness pure energy and merge it with another life form. But something went wrong. She looked down at her hands, trembling. Ethan suddenly understood. "And when I saved you?" Lyra nodded. Something in the process activated. "The bond was incomplete before, but when you touched me, when you helped me, it finished." Ethan's mind reeled. "What does that mean?" She took a shaky breath. Then she met his eyes and whispered, "It means we're connected now. I don't know how, but my body is changing. Because of you." Ethan's pulse quickened. "But that's not all." Lyra's voice was almost shaking now. "The Empire won't stop looking for me. And now, they'll come for you too." Ethan leaned back, exhaling sharply. Great, just great. He had gone from a simple space explorer to the most wanted human in the galaxy, all in less than a day. He ran a hand through his hair. "Well," he muttered, "I guess that means we're in this together." Lyra gave him a long, unreadable look. Then, slowly, she nodded. A silent agreement. They had no idea what was coming next. But one thing was certain. Everything had changed. The chase. The horizon drifted silently in deep space, barely held together by emergency power. The stars stretched endlessly beyond the viewport, distant and cold. Ethan Carter sat in the pilot's seat, running his fingers through his hair. His ship was damaged, his energy drained, and now he was connected to an alien girl who was slowly turning human. Could this day get any worse? Behind him, Lyra sat on the medical bed, staring at her hands. She was different now. The deep blue of her skin had faded, replaced with a lighter tone, almost human-like. The intricate markings that once ran down her arms had nearly vanished, leaving faint silver traces. She was changing, and she didn't know how to stop it. "I feel strange," she whispered. Her voice was softer than before, no longer filled with sharp authority, but uncertainty. Ethan glanced at her. "You and me both." He checked the ship's power levels again. Warp drive, offline. Shields, damaged. Weapons, barely functioning. He exhaled. "We're sitting ducks." Lyra's silver eyes flickered. "They will come," she said. "They always do." Ethan didn't doubt it. The Zarelian Empire, whoever they were, had hunted her across space for a reason. And now, thanks to whatever bond had formed between them, they'd be hunting him too. As if to confirm his worst fears, the ship's sensors beeped. "Warning. Multiple incoming signals. DTTTT'd." Ethan's stomach clenched. He quickly activated the display. 3 ships, small, fast, hunters. They were already closing in. "They found us," Lyra whispered. Ethan didn't waste time. He grabbed the controls and forced the Horizon's thrusters into action. The ship shuddered violently, struggling to move at full speed. The hunters were already in range. A voice crackled through the comms. Cold, sharp, and inhuman. "Surrender the fugitive and your death will be painless." Ethan gritted his teeth. "Yeah. How about no?" A second later, the enemy ships opened fire. A desperate escape. Bright blue energy bolts tore through space. The first shot grazed the Horizon's left wing, sending sparks flying inside the cockpit. Ethan cursed and yanked the controls to the side, dodging another blast. "We can't outrun them," Lyra said. Ethan shot her a look. Not with that attitude. He pushed the engines harder. The ship trembled under the strain. The hunters were faster, more advanced, and built for one purpose: capture or kill. Another blast slammed into the rear shields. The Horizon spun out of control, tumbling into open space. Ethan gritted his teeth, fighting the controls. His vision blurred for a second. He felt off. The same strange energy as before. His heartbeat slowed, his senses sharpening. It was like something was guiding his hands, moving before he even thought. He suddenly knew exactly where the enemy ships would fire next. What the hell is happening to me? But now wasn't the time for questions. He acted on instinct, twisting the ship into an impossible maneuver, diving straight into a dense asteroid field. The comms crackled again. The same cold voice. "You cannot run, human." Ethan smirked. "Watch me." The ship threaded through the asteroids, dodging, weaving, moving as if it had a mind of its own. The hunters followed, but they weren't as agile. One of them clipped an asteroid and exploded into a fiery ball. Two left. Lyra was staring at Ethan now. "You're changing." "Tell me something I don't know," he muttered, pulling the Horizon into another sharp turn. Another hunter fired, but Ethan saw it coming before it even happened. He dodged at the last second. The blast missed, hitting another asteroid instead. The explosion sent debris flying, smashing into the second hunter. Two down, one left. But the last one was smarter. It pulled back, hanging in space, blocking their only exit from the asteroid field. A trap. "We're out of options," Ethan muttered. Lyra slowly stood up. She was still weak, but something in her eyes had changed. "No," she said. "We have one option." She placed her hand on Ethan's shoulder. And suddenly, everything froze. The bond awakens. Ethan's mind exploded with visions. Flashes of Lyra's memories, her training, her capture, the experiments. He saw what they did to her, what they tried to turn her into. And now, whatever power they forced into her had bonded to him. Ethan gasped as the energy rushed through his veins, his body burning with new strength. The world slowed. He could see every movement, every pulse of energy in the enemy ship. He knew what would happen before it even happened. The hunter fired. But this time, Ethan moved before the shot even left the barrel. The Horizon twisted at an impossible angle, the energy blast missing completely. Ethan's hands were moving on their own, guided by something he couldn't explain. He fired back. One shot. Perfect, precise, deadly. The enemy ship exploded. Silence filled the cockpit. Ethan exhaled sharply, his hands trembling, his heart still beating too fast. Lyra stared at him. "You're not human anymore," she whispered. Ethan swallowed. He didn't know what he was, but he knew one thing. The Xyrelian Empire wouldn't stop. They had seen what he could do now, and they would never let him escape again. The bond. The Horizon floated in the vastness of space, battered but still intact. The cockpit was silent except for the quiet hum of the ship's emergency systems struggling to stay online. The asteroid field behind them was littered with the wreckage of their pursuers, 3 enemy hunters, now nothing more than floating debris. Ethan Carter sat in the pilot's seat, his hands still trembling. His breath was uneven, his heart still racing. Something was different. His body felt stronger, his reflexes sharper, his mind clearer than ever before. Back in the asteroid field, he had seen the future before it happened. He had moved before thinking, dodging attacks with impossible precision. And it all started when Lyra touched him. He turned his gaze to her. She sat across from him, her back against the cold metal wall, her silver eyes fixed on her hands. Her skin was no longer deep blue. It had faded to a pale, human-like tone. Her transformation was accelerating. "All right," Ethan finally said, breaking the silence. "You want to tell me what the hell just happened back there?" Lyra didn't respond immediately. Her fingers curled into fists. "I don't know," she said quietly. "I didn't think it was possible." Ethan exhaled sharply. "Yeah, well, it is. I just flew like some kind of damned super soldier, dodging shots before they even fired. And you," he gestured to her, "you're literally changing. So maybe it's time for some answers." She closed her eyes, as if trying to steady herself. Then, finally, she spoke. "I told you before. I was part of the Zarelian Empire, a warrior." Her voice was soft but tense. "But I wasn't just any soldier. I was chosen for something different." Ethan leaned forward. "The experiments." Lyra's eyes flickered with pain. "Yes, they wanted to create something beyond a warrior. A being that could merge with others, not just physically, but mentally. A perfect soldier who could adapt to any species, any battlefield. But the experiment was a failure." Ethan frowned. "Doesn't look like a failure to me." Lyra gave a bitter smile. "Because I never completed the process. They tried to force it, but my body rejected it. I escaped before they could finish." She looked down at her hands. "I thought I was safe, that it wouldn't activate." She slowly raised her gaze to Ethan. "Until you touched me." A chill ran through Ethan's spine. He remembered the shockwave of energy when he first carried her from the crash site. "What does that mean?" he asked carefully. Lyra hesitated. Then, in a whisper, she said, "It means we are bonded now." The meaning of the bond. Ethan's stomach tightened. "Bonded." Lyra rubbed her temples. "I don't know exactly how it works. No one did. But from what I remember, when the process is completed, the two beings share more than just a connection." Ethan swallowed hard. "Like what?" Lyra's silver eyes locked onto his. "Everything." A silence stretched between them. Ethan felt his pulse quicken. He thought about what had happened in the fight, the way his senses sharpened, the way he moved without thinking. And now, Lyra's body was changing, adapting to him. "Are you saying you're turning human?" he asked slowly. Lyra let out a shaky breath. "It's possible. The process was meant to make me adapt to the strongest compatible species nearby." Ethan's brows furrowed. "And humans are what?" "The best option." Lyra hesitated. "Humans are different." She searched for the right words. "Your kind survives in ways that other species don't. Not through superior strength, not through advanced technology, but through sheer will. You fight when others surrender. You push forward when others break." She exhaled. "I think my body is responding to that." Ethan leaned back, running a hand down his face. "So, what? You're just gonna turn into a human?" "I don't know," Lyra admitted. "The changes aren't stopping. I can feel it inside me." Ethan shook his head, frustration bubbling up. "And what about me? Why the hell can I see attacks before they happen? Why do I suddenly feel like I could take on an army?" Lyra looked at him seriously. "Because the bond works both ways." Ethan felt a chill at her words. "You're gaining something from me, just as I'm changing because of you." He exhaled sharply. "So what does that make me?" Lyra stared at him, her expression unreadable. "Something new. The Empire strikes back." Before Ethan could respond, the ship's alarms suddenly blared. His heart leaped into his throat. He spun back to the control panel. "Warning! Long-range scans DETCT multiple ships is AP proaching. Lyra stiffened. They found us. Ethan cursed. How? We destroyed the hunters. Lyra's jaw clenched. They must have tracked the energy spike when we escaped. Ethan's fingers flew across the controls, scanning the incoming signals. His stomach dropped. 6 ships, larger than the hunters, heavily armed. We can't fight that, Ethan said. We won't have to, Lyra said. There's a planet nearby. A dead world. If we land there and shut down the power, we might be able to hide. Ethan didn't like it, but they had no choice. Fighting was suicide. He punched the controls, sending the Horizon speeding toward the barren planet. Behind them, the 6 enemy ships locked onto their position. The descent. The ship shook violently as they entered the planet's atmosphere. The landscape below was a wasteland of cracked earth and jagged mountains, shrouded in mist. Ethan pushed the thrusters, weaving between rocky cliffs. The enemy ships followed, firing blinding energy blasts that tore through the sky. One shot clipped their engines. The Horizon lurched, systems failing one by one. We're not gonna make it, Ethan shouted. Lyra's eyes glowed for a second. She reached out, grabbing Ethan's arm. And suddenly, he saw it. An image, clear as day, a hidden cave, deep inside the mountains. This way, Lyra shouted, pointing. Ethan didn't hesitate. He veered left, diving straight for the rocky cliffs. The ship plunged into the mist, disappearing just before an enemy blast struck. They crashed into the cave entrance, sliding to a violent stop. Rocks collapsed behind them, sealing them in. Silence. Ethan gasped for breath, his hands shaking. We made it, he muttered. Lyra exhaled, staring at the sealed entrance. For now, she said, but they won't stop looking. She turned to Ethan, her silver eyes dark with warning. This is only the beginning. The enemy returns. The silence before the storm. The horizon lay in darkness, hidden deep within the cavern's jagged walls. Outside, the planet's surface was a wasteland, cold, empty, and wrapped in thick layers of fog. No light from the distant stars reached this place. Ethan Carter sat against the metal wall of his ship, breathing heavily. His muscles ached, his mind still buzzing with the aftershocks of the last fight. They had barely made it. Across from him, Lyra was sitting on the floor, hugging her knees. Her transformation had progressed even further. Her once blue skin was now entirely pale, her markings nothing more than faint silver traces. Her silver eyes, once cold and alien, were now filled with something unfamiliar. Emotion. Ethan watched her carefully. She hadn't spoken much since the crash. She just sat there, lost in thought. Still feeling strange? He finally asked. Lyra glanced at him. I feel different. Her voice was quieter now, softer. Different how? She hesitated before whispering. I feel human. Ethan's chest tightened. That was impossible. Was she really becoming one of them? Or was she something entirely new? Before he could ask more, the ship's warning systems flickered on. A faint peeping sound echoed in the cockpit. Ethan's heart dropped. Incoming signal detected. He moved fast, checking the scanners. His blood ran cold. They were back. The hunt begins. Outside the cavern, 3 massive warships had entered the planet's orbit. Unlike the hunter ships from before, these were larger, heavier, built for one thing: destruction. Lyra moved beside him, eyes narrowing at the display. They're deploying ground forces. Ethan clenched his fists. Of course they are. They don't want to risk another space battle. The scanners showed dozens of life forms descending in drop pods, landing near the mountains. They were sending an elite strike force to find them. And this time, Ethan knew, they weren't planning to take prisoners. Lyra turned to him. We have to move. Move where? We're trapped in a cave, Ethan shot back. Lyra looked at the scanner again. "There's a way out," she said. "Through the underground tunnels." Ethan raised an eyebrow. "You saw this before." Lyra hesitated. "I felt it." That same connection again. She was seeing things before they happened, just like Ethan had in the last fight. Their bond was evolving. Ethan didn't have time to question it. The enemy was coming. "All right," he said. "We go dark. No signals, no noise. We move fast." Lyra nodded. "If we get caught, we don't stop running." "Sounds like a plan." They stepped into the darkness of the tunnels. Through the shadows, the tunnel stretched deep under the planet's surface, twisting in endless directions. The air was damp, filled with the scent of ancient stone and something else, something alive. Ethan held his weapon close, his flashlight barely cutting through the thick fog ahead. Lyra walked beside him, silent and alert. "We need to get out before they find the cave," Ethan whispered. But as they turned a corner, Lyra suddenly stopped. Her breath caught. Her silver eyes widened. Ethan tensed. "What is it?" Then a sound echoed through the tunnels. A low, clicking noise. Ethan's blood ran cold. They weren't alone. A shadow moved ahead. Something massive shifted in the darkness. And then it attacked. The Forgotten Guardians. A creature lunged at them from the darkness. A towering beast of metal and bone. Its eyes burning with red light. It moved too fast, its claws swiping at Ethan's chest. Ethan barely dodged in time, rolling across the ground as the beast crashed into the stone wall. Lyra sprang into action, her movements unnaturally fast. She grabbed Ethan's arm, pulling him away just as the creature roared and charged again. "Run!" Lyra shouted. They sprinted through the tunnels, the beast crashing through the walls behind them. More clicking sounds echoed in the distance. There was more than one. Ethan cursed. "What the hell are these things?" Lyra's face was pale. "I think they were left behind. Guardians of this place." Ethan shot her a look. "You could have mentioned that earlier." Lyra didn't answer. She just grabbed Ethan's wrist again. And suddenly, he saw the way out. It flashed in his mind like a vision. Twisting paths, turns, the exit leading to the far side of the mountain. They just had to survive long enough to reach it. The chase through the abyss. The creatures were faster than expected. They moved like shadows, darting through the tunnels, closing in with terrifying speed. Ethan's lungs burned as he ran, Lyra just ahead of him, guiding them through the endless corridors. The walls blurred as his vision sharpened again, his body reacting seconds ahead of time, dodging obstacles without thinking. The bond was changing him, more than he realized. A roar split the air, and suddenly, one of the creatures leaped at them. Ethan had no time to raise his weapon. But Lyra moved first. She twisted in midair, her body faster than any human, her hands glowing with a strange blue energy. She slammed her palm into the beast's chest, and the creature exploded into dust. Ethan stumbled to a stop, staring at her. Lyra was breathing heavily, her hands still sparking with that same energy. "What was that?" Ethan whispered. Lyra looked down at her hands, her eyes filled with something between fear and wonder. "I don't know," she admitted, "but I think I'm finally unlocking what they tried to make me." Ethan's mind reeled. She was becoming something far more dangerous than even the Zarelians had expected. And if she was changing, then so was he. The final escape. The tunnel suddenly opened into a massive cavern, and there in the distance was the exit, a narrow gap leading back to the surface. But standing between them and freedom were a dozen Zarelian soldiers. They had been waiting, weapons raised. Ethan and Lyra skidded to a stop. One of the officers, clad in dark armor, stepped forward. His voice was sharp, his expression cold. "You cannot run anymore," he said. "Surrender the experiment." Ethan clenched his fists. His body was still buzzing with energy, his mind sharp. He could feel the outcome of this battle before it even started. Lyra slowly turned to him, her expression calm but deadly. "We're not running anymore," she whispered. Ethan smirked. "That's what I was hoping you'd say." Then, together, they charge. The transformation. The standoff. The cavern was silent, except for the hum of Zyrelian weapons. Ethan Carter stood in front of Lyra, fists clenched, heart pounding. His body buzzed with energy, the same strange power that had awakened inside him since their bond formed. Across from them, 12 Zyrelian soldiers stood in formation, their dark armor reflecting the faint glow of their weapons. At the center, their leader, a tall figure with gleaming silver armor and piercing yellow eyes, took a step forward. "You have no idea what you've done, human," the officer said coldly. "You were never supposed to touch her. You were never supposed to survive." Ethan's jaw tightened. "Yeah, well, you can take your 'supposed to' and shove it." The Zyrelian leader raised his weapon. "Last chance. Surrender the experiment." Ethan glanced at Lyra. She wasn't trembling anymore. She wasn't afraid. She looked ready. Her silver eyes locked onto his. "I'm not an experiment." And then she moved. The battle unleashed. Lyra vanished from sight, a blur of motion, faster than any human could track. The soldiers barely had time to react before she slammed into them, her hands crackling with blue energy. The first soldier was thrown back, crashing against the cave wall with a sickening crunch. Another raised his weapon, but Lyra grabbed his wrist, twisting it with unnatural strength before flipping him onto the ground. Ethan didn't waste time. His body reacted before his mind could process. He could see their movements. A soldier lunged toward him with a plasma blade. Ethan already knew where the strike would land. He dodged before the attack even began. His instincts took over. His strength felt different now. Sharper, faster ***. He caught the soldier's wrist, yanked him forward, and delivered a powerful elbow strike to his chest. The Zyrelian collapsed, gasping. Another enemy fired a plasma round. Ethan twisted his body, the shot missing by inches. He leaped forward and landed a devastating punch, and to his shock, the soldier flew back as if he had been hit by a cannon. Ethan stared at his own fist. What the hell was happening to him? Across the battlefield, Lyra was unleashing devastation. She moved like a phantom, appearing and disappearing in flashes of blue energy. Every strike she landed sent a shockwave of force through her enemies. One soldier aimed at her. Lyra raised her hand, and suddenly, his weapon disintegrated in his grip. Ethan's breath caught. She's evolving. And so was he. The last warrior standing. Within moments, the Zyrelian squad lay defeated, groaning in pain, their weapons destroyed. Only the officer remained. His yellow eyes flickered between Ethan and Lyra. "You've become something unnatural," he growled. "You don't even realize what you are." Ethan stepped forward. "Why don't you enlighten us?" The officer let out a slow breath. Then he pulled something from his belt, a small pulsating device. A detonator. Ethan's stomach dropped. "Your transformation is unfinished," the officer said. "But if we can't capture you, we'll make sure no one else does." Then he pressed the switch. The cave shook violently, and the walls began to collapse. The cave is falling. Rocks crashed from above. The ground splintered beneath them. Ethan grabbed Lyra's wrist. Time to go. They sprinted through the collapsing cavern, dodging falling boulders. The officer had vanished in the chaos, probably crushed beneath the debris. Ahead, Ethan saw a crack of light. An exit. But the ground suddenly gave way beneath them. Ethan's feet slipped, and for a terrifying second, he was falling into darkness. Then, Lyra caught him. Her grip was impossibly strong, her silver eyes glowing. And then, Ethan felt it again. That pulse of energy. The same force that had awakened inside him before, but this time, stronger. His entire body burned with light. Lyra's arms trembled as she pulled him up, but something was different. Her skin, where she touched him, was no longer cold alien flesh. It was warm, human. She gasped, staring at herself. It's happening faster. Ethan grabbed her hand. We don't have time to think about it. Run. They burst through the cave's exit just as the entire cavern collapsed behind them. The explosion sent them flying through the air. Ethan crashed into the dirt, rolling onto his side, coughing. He looked up. The Xyrelian warships were still in orbit, but they weren't firing. They were watching, studying them. Ethan's hands clenched into fists. They're testing us, he realized. They want to see how much we've changed. Lyra's voice was barely a whisper, and we're still changing. What are they becoming? Ethan turned to Lyra, his breath still ragged. She looked completely different now. Her skin was fully human, her features delicate yet sharp, like a fusion of both species. But her silver eyes remained, glowing softly in the dim light. She touched her face as if she didn't recognize herself. Then she looked at Ethan. You too. Ethan frowned. What? She reached out, placing a hand over his chest. The moment she touched him, he felt it. His own heartbeat was different. Faster, stronger. He looked at his hands. His veins shimmered with a faint blue glow, pulsing in rhythm with Lyra's own. They weren't just bonded. They were becoming something else. Lyra swallowed hard. I think we're... She trailed off, unable to finish, because they both knew the truth. They weren't human anymore. And they weren't Xyrelian either. They were something new. The Empire's warning. The warships above suddenly began to pull away, retreating into deep space. Ethan narrowed his eyes. Why are they leaving? Lyra's expression was grim. They're afraid. Ethan turned to her. Of us. Lyra nodded. They don't know what we are anymore. And neither do we. Ethan exhaled. That's not good. Lyra shook her head. No, it's worse. She met his eyes, her voice barely above a whisper. They won't stop. They'll come back with more ships, more firepower. They'll bring the whole empire if they have to. Ethan swallowed hard. He had started this journey as a simple human explorer. Now he was something else entirely. Something the universe had never seen before. And the Xyrelian Empire would do anything to wipe him out. But Ethan clenched his fists. He wasn't running anymore. If they wanted a war, he was ready. The final choice. A moment of silence before the storm. The warships had left. But Ethan knew it wasn't over. The Xyrelian Empire didn't retreat because they gave up. They retreated because they were afraid. Not of what he and Lyra were now, but of what they might become. And that fear meant only one thing. They were coming back. He stood at the edge of the rocky cliff, looking up at the sky. The planet was barren, lifeless, its cracked surface stretching endlessly into the horizon. Beside him, Lyra sat on a boulder, staring at her hands. Her human hands. The transformation was complete now. Her once blue skin was fully pale and smooth, her silver eyes the only thing that still held a trace of what she once was. She looked like a human, but she wasn't one. Neither of them were. Ethan clenched his fists. His body felt different, stronger, faster, more alive than it had ever been. His senses stretched beyond what he thought was possible. He could hear the faint hum of energy running through Lyra's veins. He could feel the heartbeat of this planet, the vibrations of its shattered ground. Whatever bond had formed between them, it was complete now. But what did that mean? And what happened next? The warning. A soft breeze blew across the cliffside. Lyra spoke without looking at him. You can still run, she said. Ethan turned to her, frowning. What? She finally looked up. Her silver eyes were haunted, filled with an emotion Ethan hadn't seen in her before. Guilt. The Empire won't stop, she said. They'll come back, with more ships, more firepower, the entire fleet if they have to. Ethan exhaled sharply. let them. Lyra shook her head. No, you don't understand. She stood up, stepping closer. Ethan, they won't just come for you. They'll come for Earth. His breath caught. She continued. They saw what we've become, and they're afraid. They won't let humans exist now that they know your kind can change. She hesitated. They'll burn your world to the ground to make sure no one else like us is ever created. Ethan's stomach turned to ice. Earth. His home. His people. He had always thought of the Zarelian Empire as a distant threat, something happening far away from human space. But now, because of him, Earth was in danger. He took a slow step back, running a hand through his hair. His mind raced, trying to process what she was saying. There had to be a way. There had to be something they could do. Lyra watched him carefully. I can end this, she said. Ethan turned sharply. What? She took a deep breath. I can go back to them. Surrender myself. If I let them take me, they won't come for Earth. Ethan's blood boiled. Are you insane? He stepped closer, his voice rising. You think they'll just stop? You think they'll just take you and call it a day? He shook his head. They'll kill you, or worse, and then they'll still come for me. Lyra swallowed hard. If you run, you can survive. You can disappear into human space. Warn your people. I'll do what I can to delay them. No, Ethan growled. Lyra flinched. She had expected him to argue. She had expected him to fight back. But she hadn't expected the look in his eyes. It wasn't fear. It wasn't panic. It was rage. Pure, burning rage. Ethan took a slow step toward her. I'm done running. His voice was low, steady, deadly serious. I'm done hiding. I'm done playing by their rules. He turned and pointed up at the sky. They're coming for us. Good. Let them come. Lyra's breath hitched. Ethan. He looked at her, his blue glowing hands clenched into fists. We end this. Together. The final stand. The next few hours were spent preparing for war. Ethan and Lyra worked in perfect synchronization, their minds almost linked, as if they could feel what the other was thinking. They modified the horizon, setting up an energy shield, rerouting power to the weapons, crafting a final battleground where they would make their stand. They weren't going to run. They were going to fight. Then the sky burned. The Zarelian fleet had arrived. 10 massive warships dropped from hyperspace, surrounding the planet like hungry predators. Their metallic hulls gleamed under the distant light of a dying sun. Ethan took a deep breath. Showtime. The first wave of fighters descended, dozens of sleek Zarelian ships, moving in perfect formation. Their weapons glowed with deadly energy. Ethan and Lyra stood together at the edge of the battlefield. Lyra turned to him one last time. If we don't survive this, she whispered. Ethan smirked. Then we make sure they don't either. Lyra exhaled. Then she reached for his hand. The moment their fingers touched, the entire battlefield shifted. A wave of pure energy exploded outward, crackling through the air. Ethan felt it deep inside him. The full connection between them, the power of their bond, the unstoppable force of what they had become. Lyra's eyes glowed bright silver. Ethan's own body hummed with the same energy. The Zarelian fleet hesitated. They could feel it too. Fear. For the first time, the mighty Zarelian warriors were afraid. Then Ethan and Lyra attacked. The war ends here. The battle that followed would be remembered forever. Ethan and Lyra moved like lightning, weaving through enemy fire, their bodies no longer bound by the limits of flesh and bone. Every ship that fired upon them was torn apart by raw energy. Every soldier that tried to land on the planet was crushed under a wave of force. They weren't human anymore. They weren't Zarelian either. They were something new, something unstoppable. The Zarelian command ship tried to retreat. Ethan lifted his hand, and reality itself seemed to bend. With a single motion, the massive warship collapsed in on itself, folding into a single point before vanishing into nothingness. The remaining ships fled. The battle was over. They had won. What comes next? Ethan and Lyra stood on the now silent battlefield. The sky above them was empty. The Empire was gone. For now. Lyra turned to Ethan. "What are we?" she whispered. Ethan looked at his hands. He still felt the power, but something was different now. It wasn't wild anymore. It was his. He met Lyra's eyes. "We're the future." She exhaled, a small smile playing on her lips. "Human," she whispered, "what have you done to me?" Ethan smirked. "Made you something better." And together, they stepped forward into the unknown. The end.